Hello, and this week we're going to look at the Romantic and Gothic movement, which happened in the United States before the Civil War. What I would like you to discover from this presentation is be able to examine the beginnings of American fiction, understand the elements of Romanticism, analyze themes in early 19th century American fiction, list the writers of this period, explain Gothic literature, and explore the writings of Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne, two of the major writers of this period. American fiction starts around 1800 when the movement of Romanticism came about, and off of this Romanticism came the Gothic movement, of which we'll be talking about both of those today. Then the Civil War intervened and American society changed, and you get two different kinds of approaches to fiction, realism and naturalism, which we will be talking about next week. And realism got broken down into regionalism, where people wrote about the specific area of the country that they lived in. If we look at America before the Civil War, we can think of three economies going on and three different cultures. We can talk about the North, which is primarily New England and the upper Midwest, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin, which were industrialized and farming. There were factories in the North. There was a great deal of urban sophistication in New York and Boston and Philadelphia. In the South, it was far more agricultural, where cotton was the primary crop that was grown. It was a place that was dominated by large plantations, many times thousands of acres, and slavery. In the far west, you have mining in California and also in Nevada and Utah. There, the people were far more independent and more unconventional, that they were definitely not the people that you would see in either the North or the South. So, where did Romanticism come out of? Well, it was a reaction to the formalism of the Enlightenment, which was the period just before 1750, 1770. If we look at ladies' fashions, I think ladies' fashions often indicate the tenor of the times. Here is a picture of Martha Washington. You will notice that she is very formally dressed in silks and satins, and the garment looks rather stiff, and she looks rather stiff in her pose. If you go another 75 years after Martha, to Dolly Madison, who was another First Lady, you can see that she is far more relaxed, the pose is far more relaxed, and the garment seems a little bit softer. And so the Romanticism went from a very rigid formality of what is called the late Baroque into the softer, more textural feelings of Romanticism. The Enlightenment, which is that period, thought reason was supreme. It was the age of Newton, where everyone thought that the world and everything in it could be measured, and you could have a sort of a clockwork universe going on. The origins of Romanticism are in England, but America picked up on it and made it uniquely itself. It's the first literary movement in America. Before that, all writers were basically in the mode of what was happening in England. The Romantics were primarily interested in intuition, and feelings were supreme. So what were the influences on Romanticism? Well, first of all, the growth of the country. If you look at a map of the United States, you can see that originally that the first 13 colonies were just along the East Coast. By the treaty, when we signed with Great Britain for our independence, the treaty gave us everything up to the Mississippi. By 1803, we had acquired the Louisiana Purchase, which took up most of the middle. We then got California and the southwestern states from Mexico, and the Oregon Territory. But if you will notice that basically the entire United States was part of the country by 1850. This was part of the idea of manifest destiny, that the United States needed to be a country that ran from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and every effort was made by presidents and to annex, steal, bribe, buy the land that they felt was necessary. Also part of it was the Industrial Revolution, which started in Great Britain and quickly moved to the United States in the 1750s, 1775 area. It included large factories, many times using water wheels as a power source to generate machines. They employed huge numbers of people, particularly in the Northeast. And the working conditions were terrible. It also saw the invention of the steam engine. By 1865, the United States was connected by railroad from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. Also was the invention of the steamboat. Most of the steamboats were on the Mississippi and its tributaries. They carried both cargo and passengers up and down the Mississippi, all the way from St. Louis and over to Cairo, Illinois, down to St. Louis, and finally ending up in New Orleans. The Romantics were also interested in the common people. American literature did not have kings and queens and nobility, and so the people that were in their stories were ordinary people. Not too many of them deal with women in a positive way. A few do, but most do not. But that would change after the Civil War, when more women began to write. It was also a time of economic growth. Many banks existed. Many of them printed their own money. Unfortunately, what was $5 in one place might be worth $4 someplace else. And so the national government sort of took over and instituted a national currency. It was a time of economic growth as well. The big issue up into the Civil War was slavery. One of the main acts was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It allowed bounty hunters to go into the North and elsewhere and arrest or basically kidnap African Americans who were thought to be escaped slaves. If you saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, it covers this particular thing. The Fugitive Slave Act deeply divided the country over slavery. The North, which was more abolitionist than the South, actively thwarted the law and hid escaped slaves so that they could escape to Canada, where they would not be brought back. There was also the Western movement, starting in the 1820s, moving into the Louisianas and over into the Oregon and Washington state areas. You have the Mormons moving into Utah in the late 1840s, early 50s, setting up Salt Lake City. And so a lot of activity was moving people westward. Again, this was part of the manifest destiny that the entire continent of North America between the oceans was the United States. If we look at the three areas I mentioned, the South was heavily agricultural with huge plantations and growing cotton. Cotton was labor intensive. With the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, the production of cotton was made much easier. Cotton has a very hard seed in the middle of it that was difficult to pull out. The cotton gin allowed that to happen, so it was easier to produce large amounts of cotton. The only problem is it needed a large labor force to pick it, which led to the institution of slavery. And again, in 1838 was the last year, according to federal law, that slaves could be imported. However, there was smuggling of slaves, and the population of slaves, if you were born a slave, your children were slaves. And so many of the slaves were generations of slaves. If you look at this map, you can see that in 1790, there was very little concentration of slavery. It was basically along the East Coast. By 1860, you can see that it was spread all along the South. Now, part of that is for legal reasons. The Congress passed laws that said that slavery was not permitted above Virginia, Kentucky area. So those areas do not have any slavery. Mississippi was allowed to vote whether they wanted slavery or not. It was part of what was called the Missouri Compromise. And of course, Texas was allowed to have slavery. Further west, slavery was not practiced in California or any other territories. So slavery was primarily concentrated in the Southeast. If we look at the North was more industrial. Again, mills which turned cotton into cloth. And so a lot of the cotton was shipped out of Charlotte and other ports like New Orleans to the New England area, where it was turned into fabrics. There were also larger urban areas in the North, particularly Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were the three main urban areas. Of course, the richer areas of New York were nice, but the other areas were often very poor, squalid living conditions. There was no real sanitation, and so disease was always a concern. Outside the cities, there were the small farms using cattle and horses for plowing and taking care of the fields. Most farms in the North were much smaller than in the South. Many of them were less than 100 acres, and some of them were only 40 acres, and they tended to be passed down in generations. In the West, which was basically anything west of the Mississippi, before the American Revolution, west was anything west of the Appalachian Mountains. As people moved into the Kentuckys and Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, then west became west of the Mississippi. Living was basic. Many of the TV shows that show the Old West are pretty accurate in dirt streets, maybe a sidewalk of wood, definitely a saloon, and then a couple of other stores that would handle what was needed. In the Great Plains, People had to be more inventive because there were not many trees. Some of them built sod houses, which were covered with grass, and built the walls out of turfs or grass so that they made bricks out of them. In the far west, you had the gold rush of 1849, which drew a lot of people over to California. Many of them took wagon trains across the country. Many more took ships around South America and up the coast of South America to San Francisco, which was a thriving town at this time, very cosmopolitan. It had a lot of Chinese immigrants to it, which is why San Francisco, even to this day, has a huge Chinatown. So what are the Romanticism? What are the elements? Well, I said it's a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. They've valued imagination, intuition, idealism, individuality, and inspiration. And these came from nature, and we'll look at some of the artwork that came out of the Romantic element too. This is from Ralph Waldo Emerson. We'll talk about him a little bit later. In the presence of nature, a wild delight runs through the man. In spite of real sorrows, nature says, "He is my creature," and maugre all his impertinent griefs, "He shall be glad with me." Maugre means in spite of. It's a word that we don't use anymore. But it's basically, if you go to nature, you will be happy. And so this inspired people to go and paint art. It's the first real arts trend in America, where they would go off and paint nature. And once California became part of the country and the gold rush and everything, that the artists went west and painted that too. But you will notice that most of it is scenery, and it's rather bucolic, meaning that it's rather country and peaceful. Romanticism had certain themes that it wanted to take part in. First of all, the Romantics were very interested in writing about Americans and American themes. Since we did not have royalty, we didn't worry about the action of kings and queens and knights of the round table and that. So we get characters like Rip Van Winkle, a gentleman that falls asleep before the American Revolution and wakes up after it, not realizing that it happened, of which part of this humor comes from the story. Also, many people were gathering folk tales. Harris went about collecting stories from the slaves that he knew, and on the farms he went out. He was a newspaper writer in Atlanta, and so he wrote Uncle Remus books. Today, many of the stories are considered racist, although he never did in his time. He thought he was preserving African American culture before it disappeared. He was an abolitionist against slavery in the city of Atlanta in the Deep South, so he was not always popular for his views. Individualism was also appreciated, and you will see that in the story of Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, where Hester Prynne is ostracized from her community because she has an illegitimate child, and she refuses during the entire novel to tell anyone who the father of the child is. By the end of the story, you do find out, and it's a shocker, so I won't tell you in case you want to read the story. We also, for the Romantics, were interested in the exotic, Native Americans. James Fenimore Cooper, Last of the Mohicans. We had artists like Catlin going out, taking paintings of Native Americans, not only portraits, but of their daily life, which is one of our earliest pictures and documentary of how Native Americans lived before the Great Resettlement, where they were all forced to move into reservations. Also, you get the poem Hiawatha by Longfellow, who became a hero figure for the wise Native American. Also, you get Gothic writers like Poe and Hawthorne, and we'll talk about them in a little bit when we talk about. He was an American composer, one of the first widely recognized in the United States and in Europe as a great composer. He was mixed race. Also, you can look at James Audubon, who was an ornithologist, and he traveled Florida, sketching birds of Florida. And of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe and her Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's one of the most influential books written before 1865. It brought to light many of the horrors of slavery in a fictional account. Here are some resources also that you can use.